Next, from Chicago, we sit down with the president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, John Scanlon. We discuss with Mr. Scanlon several issues related to the work of the state's trial lawyers and ask him if Illinois' workers' compensation is too high and driving businesses from the state. We also ask him about the prevalence of trial lawyers bringing frivolous lawsuits against companies, and we ask about the perception that trial lawyers cooperate exclusively with Democrat politicians. This runs about 45 minutes.
John Scanlon, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Good afternoon, Terry.
As the head of the trial lawyers, often the trial lawyers, I should say, are in the news and many times the whipping boy, so to speak, of whatever politicians want to blame you for some of the things going on. And it seems like over the last decade or so, especially the trial lawyers have been made responsible by some for a number of things. We talked off camera about going back to about 2004. The big one was medical malpractice. They did pass a bill which was then ultimately ruled unconstitutional. Now the issue is often medical or not workers' compensation insurance. And so we wanted to get your side of it because we hear so many times that the trial lawyers are the reason why businesses are fleeing Illinois, among other reasons. On that topic, as a broad opening statement, I presume you would disagree with that. Why would you say that the workers' compensation in Illinois is not too high?
Before I reach at it, I just want to say, just in a more general sense, I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in Chicago, South Side. I now live just west of the city in Downers Grove. I'm married. I have 5 kids. I love the state. I love our city of Chicago. And I care deeply about it. So my interests are not just limited to my current role as president of the Illinois Trial Lawyers or my occupation as a partner at the Healy Scanlon law firm. I really do care about our state. And my family, both sides, have been here since they came to this country. So any thought that anything in the long run would be harmful to this state, I would be against. On the other side of that, I grew up in a family where, because of their status coming to this country, oftentimes they had to take jobs that were more dangerous and difficult. And fortunately, during their lifetimes, protections were enacted for them. And we still have those today, but they're under constant attack. You brought up the topic of workers' compensation, and before I get to that, Terry, I just want to highlight how things have changed during my lifetime. I always expected our leaders in this state, in this city, to do whatever they could to make it a better place and encourage investment here. That's no longer the case. I saw something last month that I've never seen before. A governor, through his campaign, had 3 governors from adjoining states mocking us. And just think about that for a minute. I take my position as the head of this organization very seriously. I want in the worst way to make sure that when my term ends, I hand it off to somebody in the same shape or better as when I received it. That doesn't appear to be the case with our current leadership. When you ask 3 governors to go on our airwaves to mock our state, how is that going to help us in any way? It's not. Illinois is a great state, and we have a lot to be proud of. I don't know if people realize this. And I want to get this out here before we start talking about the business climate or workers' compensation. We have the 5th largest economy compared to all other 50 states. We're number 5 in the country for gross domestic product. Have you heard anybody say that in the last 5 years?
Not often.
Right. What do you hear? Everything's bad here. Well, we're still number 5 in the country. Our great detractors or mockers from Wisconsin, Indiana, or Missouri, the 3 governors of those states, when they came on the air, they don't talk about that. The reason they don't is they can't come close to our status there. They're 16, 20, and 22, respectively. Now, there's a reason we're the 5th largest economy in the country. Our businesses, our universities, our hospitals, our airports. It is still a great state and a great place to be. And this idea that somehow workers' compensation is keeping, the rates of workers' compensation is keeping employers from here, nonsense. On the list of concerns for corporate CEOs, workers' compensation insurance ranks below 60. And here specifically...
And where does that come from?
That comes from National Business Week. It's a publication. More importantly, if you look at our state individually, there may be certain states in this country where there are some problems with the workers' compensation system. And in fact, in our state, there were some legitimate concerns raised earlier, 10 years ago. And so, the legislature, democratically controlled, enacted some reforms in 2011. You're probably aware of those, right? Mm-hmm. Since 2011, I don't know if people realize this, but since 2011, 19% drop in claims payouts. That means workers' compensation companies are paying out 19% less in payouts for injured workers than they were back in 2011.
Are you talking about the insurance companies?
Yes.
Okay.
And I know what your question is going to be in a minute, and I'm going to get there. So the insurance companies pay out 19% less since the reforms of 2011. Their profits have gone up 22%. Again, we're talking about the insurance companies that write workers' compensation policies. Finally, filings are down, meaning new claims filed by injured employees are down 15%. So you have 15% less claims, 19% less in costs, and 22% increase in profits. That's from NCCI. That's an insurance industry analyst. They're not allied with anyone. They just do analysis for the industry. I'm sure you're wondering then, if you have a 22% profit increase, a 19% cost decrease, 15% decreasing in premiums, I'm sure you're wondering how much of that was passed on to the employers of our citizens. None. Last year, premiums went up 3.9%. It's incredible to think that all this additional money is being made after the reform measures, and none of it is being put back to the employers. That was the whole point of the reform legislation. Let's find a way to make it easier on our employers. Let's drive down their costs, and we can do that by making it more difficult for an injured worker to file a claim or win a claim. It was done. There is more money in the system now. It has not gone back to the employers. So we're now in a climate where for the last 2 years we've heard nothing but we need more workers' compensation reform. And the only thing I can say to that is, you're right if you're talking about reform on the insurance carriers themselves. Some type of system to ensure that when these kinds of profits are being made, some of that money filters back to employers. Anyone who would suggest that further reforms need to be made that would restrict the right of workers are wrong. 15% decline in filings tells you those reforms have drastically reduced the amount of claims filed.
Let's, Greg Bay is the head of the Illinois Manufacturers Association. I don't remember the specific numbers, but he had a press conference, and in fact I interviewed him, and we were in the at a manufacturer talking with the business owner as well as Mr. Bays. And Greg was saying the cost, let's say, of a broken arm in Illinois is something like 2 or 3 times as much as in Indiana. So might it be, maybe there's someone to blame for these costs being high. Maybe it's not the trial lawyers. Have the trial lawyers as an industry, and I know you've got businesses to run independently, it's not like you have nothing else to do. Could the blame be laid that the hospitals in Illinois, the care providers who have been so cut back on Medicaid compensation, that they're cost shifting and putting more and more of their billing to cover their operating cost onto the cost of treating workers' comp, because there is that insurance, and sometimes maybe the people who are insured coming in, maybe their insurance is nowhere near as good as the workers' compensation insurance.
So
I don't know if that's true. I'm just posing that as an issue.
It's an interesting question, and one that I've thought about. Let me first tell you, part of the 2011 reforms were a rate schedule for medical providers to reduce the amounts paid to them. And frankly, the hospitals, doctors were upset about it, but they accepted it. It did cut back on the amount that they could earn. Cost of medical care in this country is high. So certainly some of the costs that you're talking about can be attributable to medical costs. But to say that that's the bulk of the reason why awards here might be higher than Indiana probably isn't capturing the whole story. You may know this, you may not. But in a workers' compensation case...
Can I insert for the viewers here? I believe Indiana is probably the least costliest workers' comp. Is that right, in the nation?
Honestly, I can't speak to where they rank in the nation.
Illinois is where, about 7 out of 50 states?
It's actually, we are now higher or lower than that. I think we're closer to 10 at this point.
Okay.
I don't have the NCI statistics.
So the point is, on one hand, when we compare ourselves to neighboring Indiana, it's an extreme comparison because Indiana's last in the nation as far as maybe their compensation costs. If we were to compare it to other states, the gap wouldn't be as much. On the other hand, Illinois, the business people would say we're still, let's say 10. Why are we still so high? They might say if the 2011 reforms did what you said, and maybe the point is you answered it. Maybe you would say because the cost savings haven't been passed along by the insurance carriers.
Clearly haven't. Clearly haven't. The NCCI insurance body has recommended for the last 4 years that premiums go down. Cumulatively, in that period of time, if you add up all those recommendations, we're at about a 36% recommendation for a decline. None of that's happened. This last year, just came out a month ago, they recommended that the premiums go down over 10%. They just aren't doing it. Can we go back for a minute, though,
Sure.
to this distinction between Illinois and Indiana? Okay. Part of the reason our comp awards are higher here is workers' compensation awards are based generally on two things: how severe the injury is and what rate of pay a person is making. I don't know that that's the fairest way of doing things, but that's the way it's done across the country. So the same worker who's making $10 an hour, or a worker making $10 an hour who has the same injury as somebody who makes good wages, say $25 or $30 an hour at a union job, is going to have an award that's roughly a third of that, okay? I'm giving that example because to compare...
Basically to compensate the person for the lost income.
Exactly. It's the severity of the injury and the loss of income. And so your rate of pay factors in a large way to overall awards. So Illinois' awards are going to be higher than states that don't have union protections. Illinois awards are going to be higher than the state that don't pay workers well, where workers have to work 3 part-time jobs just to pay their mortgage. Do we want... I guess the fundamental question is this: do we want to reverse to the state, to a state where we have no longer good-paying blue-collar jobs? Do we want a state where people have to work 2 or 3 jobs? I sure don't. I mean, I was the benefit of family members who worked in Local 399, the building engineers. My mother was a Chicago public school teacher. They were able to work 1 job, support a family. Not amass any great wealth, but support a family the way you would expect from working a good, decent job. I don't want to go backwards. And if we did tomorrow say, we're going to adopt Indiana's policies, what's next? Because I don't know if you watched, but Indiana is losing jobs to Mexico. You understand? Carrier, they lost jobs. Carrier took jobs and put them in Mexico. So if we do match Indiana, then what's next? Do we have to match Mexico or Bangladesh? How far back do we have to go? And do we go all the way back to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle? Is that when businesses will be satisfied? We have to think about our whole society here. A bigger point that doesn't get raised is, what is happening to those people in Indiana if their comp system is more business friendly when they get injured? Who ends up paying their bills? Terry, I'll tell you who typically ends up paying those bills: taxpayers. Because if you can not get a fair comp award and you can no longer work, you're going to go on public aid and Medicaid. Same thing will happen here in this state. If the workers' compensation insurance carriers don't pay for these awards, if somehow these claims are pushed out of the system, made more difficult, and these people can't go back to work, their medical bills will be paid by Medicaid. They'll be receiving money maybe from Social Security. It'll be a public aid problem rather than a workers' compensation problem. I think it's far fairer to impose the cost of the injury on the actual environment where the injury occurred rather than on all taxpayers.
One of the key issues that often gets spoken about in this realm, and I don't necessarily want to spend our entire time just on workers' compensation, but first of all, so if someone's injured on the job, let me back up a little bit and just say how the system works. They go and they apply for workers' compensation.
They do.
It might be something obvious like a broken arm. It could be something more egregious. It could be something like a back that goes out, and the injury, an arm you think is going to typically repair itself and you'll be back to normal within a relatively short amount of time, one would expect. But there could be some other injuries that go on for years where you need to be treated over a 3, 4, 5-year period.
Certainly.
One of the issues with that is therefore then causation. So if your back goes out, was Joe playing softball on Saturday and threw his back out, or was he chopping wood on his farm in Wisconsin, but then he comes to work and says, hey, I threw my back out lifting a box of books. What are your thoughts on the causation? I don't want to get too much into the weeds. We'd spend all our day doing a seminar on this, but on causation, do the employers have a fair argument to say, look, if somebody already had injured their back or had some injury that was pre-existing, or we know that predominantly they threw their back out off work. Now, maybe they lifted a box of books at work, but that was maybe a momentary contributing factor to something that was already injured. They might say, why do we have to pay for the entire cost of care when the person had already injured themselves off work site?
So I can only speak to my experience. I've been doing this over 27 years. The first 10 years of my practice, I personally handled a lot of workers' compensation claims. Now I do all jury trials, but we have several other attorneys here who do handle workers' compensation claims. In my experience, in our cases, and what I've seen of other colleagues' cases, if you're talking about situations where there is an older person who has bad knees or a bad back, there are some people who have those conditions who are office workers who do have activities that are more likely to cause that: golf, skiing, whatever, right?
Right.
I agree with you, Terry. If that was the case, that's not who I represent. The people I represent are tile setters, sprinkler fitters, and I just want you to think for a minute. Let's take a sprinkler fitter. They put in the sprinklers in the buildings that prevent fires from becoming major disasters. All day long, they're working overhead with their arms overhead, holding up pipes, joining pipes together, working in difficult positions. Now, you may do that as a 20-year-old or even early 30s and have no problems, but do that for 25, 30 years, and by your 40s, you're probably going to have degenerative tears to your rotator cuff. Is that not part of the work environment? Yes, that person may also have.
So let's just, I can hear somebody.
That person may also have other activities maybe on a weekend he fishes or golfs. But what do you think is more likely? 40 hours a week putting up overhead pipe, or 40 hours a week kneeling as a towel setter? I mean, arbitrators are experienced. They hear these claims. They know what these people do. And if you're an office worker and you have a back issue, but you also do bodybuilding on the side, they can differentiate between those claims.
Well, and that's the thing. So, I mean, obviously there are going to be legitimate claims.
Yes.
But
and there's going to be claims that get lost.
On that issue of causation, who determines, and should there be some kind of a acknowledgement to say, if this young 30-year-old or 32-year-old was out playing soccer and twisted his knee on the soccer field, should we be applying the cost of his care entirely to his point of work?
Of course not. And that's what arbitrators are for, and those people don't get awards, okay? Can I give you an example from the other side of the spectrum?
And let's back up real quick, because I think people just understand the process here. So there are arbitrators. What do they do?
So think of a judge. In a workers' compensation case, there's no jury. Each side has an attorney. So these companies have very well-trained attorneys that just do workers' compensation defense. And believe me, they get all the medical records and they look for all the prior problems the person might have had. They find out about all their outside pursuits, and they do their best to blame something other than the work environment for causing an injury. And sometimes that is the case, and an arbitrator will write, we call them a no award. You get nothing, okay? That's what our system's about. It's an adversarial system. Each side gets to litigate and put on their evidence. Not every case is clear-cut, by the way, Terry, okay? Not every case. But let me tell you a flip side story, because no one ever talks about the flip side stories. I was a young attorney. I think I was here not even a year. And we had a call from a widow. Her husband had been shot. He worked at a college as a security guard at 35th Street. Right across the street was Robert Taylor Homes and Stateway Gardens. This campus had security for a lot of reasons, but partly because there was some gang violence in that neighborhood. His building daily would hear gunshots. They put bulletproof glass up in certain areas because some bullets would enter the building. He was shot at work while sitting at a guard station. The shooter wasn't intending to shoot him. He was intending to shoot someone else running in front of him, okay? That university refused the claim. That lady had absolutely no money coming in.
Was the individual killed or?
Dead.
Dead.
Yes. That night, dead on arrival at the hospital. Nothing for the widow. She called us. I thought for sure this would be a case that would, when I say short order, I'm talking about in a year or less, we would get turned around. We just have to litigate it. We did. Arbitrator wrote a no award, meaning we got nothing. I appealed it. The commission agreed. I appealed it to the circuit court. Circuit court agreed.
Agreed with who?
The arbitrator, meaning this
No
was not a
award.
compensable injury. 3 levels all said no. And their logic was this. The shooter wasn't aiming at the guard. Has nothing to do with the work. The guard's very position was to man that front post because they were worried about dangerous people being out front. He was a security guard protecting employees and students from just these kind of acts. He gets shot in the line of duty, and they say it had no connection with the work. I brought in Chicago police detectives to talk about this being the most dangerous beat in the most dangerous district in the city of Chicago, and introduced evidence of that, and still the arbitrator didn't write the award. We took that case all the way up to the Illinois Appellate Court and finally got justice. That was 5 years later. Now, ask yourself, how was that fair to that lady to wait 5 years? Do you know what her overall award was, by the way?
No.
$200,000, okay? A lot of people think it's some huge number in comp cases. It's not. $200,000 for the death of her husband. Another example I just want to give you.
What would a lawyer, the firm, get on something like that?
It's a 20% statutory fee.
20%.
20%.
Okay.
Another case I want to tell you about, one of my clients went to Springfield.
I want to hear the other one, but let me just, sometimes I want to underscore something. So on the business side, let's say for a law firm, just so people can follow this, if I come in and say, here's my story, and you might, firms typically would say, I would think, if you think you got a case, bring it in and we'll listen to you. You're going to then, as a business of being in the law, evaluate the merits of taking the case on, right? Because
Absolutely.
you just said you were arguing this for 5 years, had a lot of hours in there.
Oh, yes.
I don't know, for 5 years, maybe you made minimum wage on that one. I don't know what.
It's certainly, go ahead, finish your
But,
question, then
but
I'll.
the point is, there is you have to have, as it's not just the law and the law book case. If any firm is going to have to evaluate the merits of the case before you take it, right?
Yes.
That's, I guess, basically the thing I wanted to say. So you're the first
Gatekeeper.
judge, you might say, lawyers as they hear the case, because you're going to say, is this a winnable case? The way
Yes.
you know the law and your own sense of where the practice of law is in Illinois.
You're absolutely right. I consider my first function to, both for the client's sake and for our business's sake, you want to be rational about this. You're not doing a client any good dragging something out where really it's not we call them compensable injuries, where you believe it really isn't going to be a compensable injury. You're not going to do them any good. And certainly as a firm, it's not going to do us any good it's not just man hours we're putting in. We have to spend a lot of money to take doctors' depositions, to create exhibits, you name it.
Right.
So you have to think practically. However, having said that, like any other business, there are certain cases that I'll call them loss leaders, where you're going to put in a lot more time, more than what justifies, that the return will justify. But you do it because you know something's wrong and you want a chance to stake something out in the law to change it. And that case, probably one of the cases I'm most proud of. I had far bigger, more difficult jury trial cases, but I still look at that case and it makes me smile thinking about how long it took, but it worked, and how happy that woman was, even though it took 5 years, that finally what was logical was true. Can I just give you one other example there too? We were talking a little bit earlier about wage costs in this state versus in Indiana. I have a young man who was 17, working at a ski hill out west, Kane County. And his job, among other things, was to clean out the excess snow underneath one of these conveyor belt lifts that you stand on. And he'd have to crawl underneath and dig out the snow. And unfortunately for him, his arm got swept up in the belt mechanism, and he lost his arm. And he came down to Springfield to testify to the House during an open session on the workers' compensation system and how it's affected him. And I want to tell you two things about his case. He's had over 20 surgeries on this arm because the nerve endings are problematic. They've had to put skin flaps over him, just a number of different things. On one of those surgeries, and this was a clear case where he was working, doing everything he was supposed to, and his arm got taken off. On one of those surgeries, which was being done to alleviate some excruciating nerve pain, the night before the surgery, the insurance company canceled authorization for it. No valid reason was ever given. They just wanted more time to review things. No change was ever made in their position. They ultimately authorized it, but for 30 days, he went without the surgery. Why? Why was that valid to do that when doctors at Northwestern knew he was in nerve pain? It was the 10th or 11th surgery, and they knew that this flap could prevent more pain, and they just pulled the plug on it. That same young man, his weekly benefits, I think, are $170, $180 a week. That's what he gets from our overpaying comp system. So this idea that somehow people are getting, individual plaintiffs are getting some large windfall, no, that boy in a heartbeat would take back his former position, and 180 isn't enough for him to really do anything on. He still lives with his parents. So our system, if any reform is needed, it is in trying to figure out how to get the insurance companies to rebate some of that money to the employers. Okay? That's really what needs to be done here. One other thing, maybe you don't know this. Which state in the country has the most workers' compensation insurers. Illinois. We've gone up 13% in the last 10 years. We now have 322. Why are they here? 22% profits. They're keeping all the money to themselves and not allocating some of that back to employers.
I believe Speaker Madigan wanted some kind of a study done as far as if they need to, I suppose, by law, order a rollback in compensations. Are you familiar with that, and where does that stand?
Yes, there were two different proposals made. There was that, where there would be some kind of oversight on how much is a legitimate profit. That hasn't gotten anywhere. The second piece of legislation, which I was very much in favor of. I was in favor of both, but the second one in particular. There was legislation proposed that would have created a not-for-profit workers' compensation insurance carrier in the state of Illinois. The unions were behind it. The Democratic Party was behind it. It was vetoed by the governor. We would have had a not-for-profit insurance carrier out there competing with these 322 other companies. So we could have gotten fairer insurance premiums for employers. It was vetoed. I believe during the veto session they tried to override it, and they kept missing by one vote. There just weren't enough votes. There weren't enough Democrats, and we couldn't get Republicans to sign on to it. So why wouldn't that be a fair thing? Why wouldn't you allow a startup not-for-profit out there? If you think that it has to always be on the capitalistic model, well, then you would win that battle, right? Why not let that not-for-profit have a try at it? They didn't allow it. It was vetoed. That would have been a great thing, because we could have seen, in fact, what real premiums would be.
Some people will say, and we've both heard this argument in the past too, when going back to what we were saying about taking something that, and the example you gave where you argued for 5 years, sometimes people will say, yeah, but a lot of trial lawyers will get a client to bring up a case and they know that the business will just settle because of the cost of litigation. And so therefore, a lot of these trial lawyers are just bringing these suits, never meaning to go all the way to court. They'll accept a $10,000 payment, and maybe the guy who alleges injury will get $7,000 or some amount, and for a couple hours work, the trial attorney makes several $1,000s. Is that a legitimate argument?
You know, I'll say this. If there is a firm or firms doing that, they won't last long in this business. And the reason I say that is life has pendulums, and I've seen pendulums in my own business. I've been through several, 3 different waves of legislative attempts to restrict tort rights, injured persons' rights. When I first started practicing law, and when I was a law clerk, I think perhaps back then things were maybe easier where you could pretty much take any claim and try and do something with it. That's not the case. At the present time, any firm that is foolish enough to take a case where you don't have a valid basis is going to find yourself spending money on a case that you're not going to get offers from, because so many of these insurance companies now have in-house attorneys. They aren't paying outside law firms. They're watching everything. They have their own metrics and analytics, and they're not just paying money to get out of a case. They would rather grind down these law firms that are foolish enough to take those cases. And the verdicts are bearing it out. I'll give you a stat that people probably aren't familiar with. Medical malpractice cases. In this last year in Cook County, which the Chamber and others always seem to have some criticism of, plaintiffs only win 28% of trials. 72% of medical institutions or doctors win medical malpractice trials. So just in that realm alone, you better be absolutely certain if you take one of those cases that you are right and can prove it, because your odds of winning are very slight and the costs are prohibitively high. So it's not a good business model to do what you're suggesting. Maybe back in the 80s people could get by with it, but you certainly can't after these several waves of tort restriction. It just doesn't exist
I was
anymore.
going to say, does anyone keep an accounting so that maybe, I don't know, the court system, they might
Yes.
say, here's Smith and Barnes Law Firm. I'm making the name up. But if we know that basically they're the ones that are always bringing in these alleged problems that they're then settling one after another, and maybe, 95% of what they bring they just settle, and we might say they're not, is there any shaming, is there any regulation within the industry, so to speak, to every industry is going to have bad players, whether they're doctors or journalists or lawyers or whatever. You're going to have some people that debase the system and kind of game it for their own purposes. But within the legal system, whether at the court level or just the association of legal firms, is there anyone even accounting for that or trying to hold them accountable?
There are certain mechanisms that are punitive in nature for somebody who files a frivolous lawsuit. A truly frivolous lawsuit, you're at risk of being sanctioned, whether in state court and federal court. Number two, we have the Attorney Registry and Disciplinary Commission that sits over, they're part of the Supreme Court, essentially. It's a panel that investigates and prosecutes lawyer misconduct. So if, in fact, there is somebody out there committing fraud who's an attorney, their license is at risk. But I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. The idea that there's some kind of rampant filing of frivolous lawsuits is insane. It's just not practical from a business standpoint because you're not going to get anything on it. There is no insurance company out there that is going to throw money around on what they think are demonstrably false claims. They don't do it. I'm telling you, they don't do it. You will be sorely mistaken if you think that you can build a practice doing that. It's not going to work out for you from a business standpoint, and you may end up losing your license. So, no, far more likely what I see is firms that succeed and have a long history. Our firm started in the early 80s. I've been here from day one. The reason we're here and the reason we continue to do well is we take this very seriously. We look at our cases very carefully, and we only file and try the cases that we believe have merit and that we believe we have at least some possibility of winning.
Before we close out, we've spent so much time talking about workers' compensation, and rightfully so, but I'm curious, I think one thing that the trial bar will take people who otherwise don't necessarily know where else to go in a number of cases when they feel they've been wronged. It might be a medical malpractice case, it might be a workers' comp. Where is the business these days relative to a trial attorney bringing suits on the business model of work? If we win, then we get compensation. If we lose, we're out of all that money. Is it still within the medical community? Is it workers' comp? Not just this firm. I'm talking about just across the board.
Understand.
Is it fiscal? I look at the aging of the baby boomers, and a lot of times then we get into problems where people are ripping people off as their mental faculties go downhill. And
Sure.
I've just heard privately a number of those instances from friends and family.
So kind of interesting. So you're asking me, just from a business standpoint, where do I
where's
see
the growth?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So a couple things I'll say to you. Some of my biggest cases were product liability cases against, one in particular against a large overseas motorcycle manufacturer, another against a large automaker. And those cases were based on product defects where they made the motorcycles or the minivans unsafe. And one thing I can tell you, I do far less product liability today, and there's a reason why. Although financially it probably doesn't benefit me, I certainly am proud of the fact that looking back to say when I started doing products liability in the mid-90s to now, vehicles, automobiles, are so much safer. We used to get a lot of calls on rollovers, right? You're familiar with the term rollover, when the SUVs would roll over? Mm-hmm. It can still happen, but it's far less likely because they have, the auto manufacturers, learned to be very careful about short, tall vehicles. And they also have different systems now that will correct, auto-correct. Seat belts, airbags, glass that doesn't shatter. All those things came about because attorneys believed in cases and pursued manufacturers when they were creating products that were dangerous. After a time, after a number of those suits, manufacturers would respond, and they'd come up with safer features. So perhaps in that specific area, automobiles particularly, things have gotten a lot safer. I feel like in certain areas, though, things have gotten less safe. You know, I'm not so sure the FDA has enough time or willingness to make sure that our prescription drugs are really safe. And a lot of times prescription drugs are tested and promoted or authorized for a specific use, and yet when it gets out into the field, they're being prescribed off-label for things that aren't safe. So there's areas there, particularly with the aging population, there's a lot of drugs that do harm that people aren't ever aware of. They just can't be aware of. You know, it takes a more learned person to explain that to them, and a lot of times doctors don't have the ability, and a lot of times manufacturers don't want you to know how much risk is involved. So
I suppose one could make the argument, and not to make the argument for you or the industry, but I think as a realistic, there's only so many cops on the beat. There's
yes,
only so many
true.
regulators. There are going to be people, and we see it in recent news. Wells Fargo famously, I mean, had a golden reputation of a
Right.
financial institution. And lo and behold, they're opening up accounts without people's permission. No one would have imagined
I know.
an organization with the sterling reputation that they had of ever doing that, and
Right.
yet they did. And I think, again, this is somewhat making the point as far as people would say, it's not to say we're not supposed to have trial lawyers and not supposed to have some recourse to bring a lawsuit, because there are going to be bad actors that the individual is not going to have the financial wherewithal, the typical middle-class person, to hire an attorney and just bring a suit on their own, paying just an hourly fee if there's not going to be the business model that you employ, I guess, or the field employs, where you take a case that you think there's a good chance of winning it, and that there's going to be some compensation for yourself and the firm. And I don't mean it, you just John Scanlon, but extrapolate that across the trial bar.
Certainly, there's, you know, anytime there's an effort, say, to reduce fees or to cap awards, some of the motivation behind that is to drive people out of this business. And this business, either intended or unintended, does great societal good. Because we are, as private citizens, investigating corporations on behalf of our clients, things get uncovered that would never get uncovered by a governmental body because they don't have the budget, or, in our current climate, because there's been directives, whether it be from Washington or Springfield, to stop looking into environmental problems or safety issues in the workplace. Well, if the government isn't going to do that, the only chance as a society we have is if private individuals will undertake that huge task. And there's risk for us. People just look at cases we win, and we lose too. And we get nothing when we lose. So it's a commitment that not everybody is up for taking. I myself have found it fascinating and very rewarding. On a lot of personal levels rewarding. So we live in a world where so many regulations are being taken down. You can have a position on that, right or wrong, but if you're going to take away regulations on companies, somebody should have the ability then to look into things when they do go wrong, if the government is not going to do it. And that is what we do. We look into things. And sometimes there's nothing there. Other times there is something there that needs to be exposed and talked about.
I've kept you longer than I should, but look, if I can squeeze one more question in here. Since the Illinois Channel covers so much politics, what happens in Springfield? We're going into a political election year. The presumption is that the trial bar operates almost exclusively or cooperates exclusively with Democrats or vice versa. Why Is that true? And if it is true, why is that true? To what extent does the bar, the Illinois Trial Lawyers Association, I should say, try to reach out to Republicans? And to the extent that you do, I don't know if you should be doing it more or not, but to the extent that you do reach out, do you fund them? Or is it that you just find that those who are Republicans in the legislature tend not to ever be willing to consider your point of view?
So let me just say, in my years of experience, I am familiar with, both on the national level and local level, certain Republicans that do care more about worker safety or consumer rights. I suppose if you're asking me, is it the Illinois Trial Lawyers' position to support a political party? No. It is our political position to support whichever legislators are going to do what they can to make sure workplaces are safe for our clients, products are safe for our clients, and practices are safe for the patients. I'm for that, and that's what our organization is for. A safe work environment, a healthy environment, one that we don't have to worry about what we're breathing, safe hospitals, safe roadways. And I don't care what side of the political divide you're on. If you're for that, I'd be for you, and so would our organization. So anybody who's going to do something to improve the safety on our roads, safety of trucks on our roads, that's a good thing. And, I think that's the simplest way of answering that.
All right, well, John Scanlon, we appreciate your time, and good luck to you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.